So after the lackluster sales of Ace Combat 6 in late 2007, Namco Bandai Games had to sit down and evaluate how they would approach the next couple of Ace Combat releases. And something that immediately stands out when you look at the sales history of the Ace Combat games is that Ace Combat X, the PSP spin-off, outsold Ace Combat 6. So not only would ACX have generated more revenue for the company, but it also would have been much cheaper to produce, being a simple repurposing of Ace Combat 4 for the handheld system compared to the incredibly high production value of AC6. So while they worked on planning out the next mainline installment, which we will certainly come back to on this series soon, they also greenlit a sequel to Ace Combat X, even allowing Access Games to helm the development again. So did Access Games manage to spice up the formula even more to make an extra memorable title, or did they become a little too complacent for a PSP title releasing in 2010? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 10th in a series of videos where I'm playing every Ace Combat game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the rest of the videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with the series if you haven't seen them, so I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you who want to go check those out first. And just before we start the video proper, I want to mention that my voice might sound a little weird in this one, and you might hear cuts where it sounds sort of jarring. I've been basically on the verge of losing my voice this entire week, and I've been trying to fight it off, so I recorded this video's voiceover in a lot of smaller segments, and you might catch some of that weirdness. Anyway, back to the video. But with that out of the way, Ace Combat X2 Joint Assault is a combat flight simulation game developed by Access Games and published by Namco Bandai Games for the PlayStation Portable in 2010. And those of you who have played ACX for yourself or have seen my video on it will probably immediately realize, but X2 uses that game as a base and simply adds on top of it while also changing some of the core gameplay. This isn't a bad thing, of course. Ace Combat 0 is a common favorite among fans after all, but Ace Combat X2 is essentially just a standalone expansion for Ace Combat X, and I always like to mention stuff like that in these videos just to kind of set the expectation going in. And on that note, the game uses a similar campaign structure to ACX, but it's a little different this time around. Rather than having 3 or 4 missions available at a time that all affect one another based on the order you complete them in, the structure here is much more similar to Air Combat or Ace Combat 2, where the game is mostly played in a linear order, but every once in a while you'll be given a choice between 2 different missions. This format works perfectly fine, but man do I wish they had brought back the freedom that was present in ACX, as I found that to be one of the most enjoyable parts of that game. But the biggest difference in X2's campaign isn't what longtime Ace Combat fans would have come to expect. The subtitle of the game, Joint Assault, actually comes from the fact that the game's campaign was designed to be fully playable in co-op with up to 4 players being in your squad. This leads to a couple of key changes in the game that we'll go over throughout the video, but the first of them is that the game's difficulty can be changed every time you launch a mission rather than just being set at the beginning of your campaign, in order to make playing in co-op with your friends a much smoother and more convenient experience. And it should go without saying, but having the option to just lower the difficulty if you're really stuck on a mission and simply want to get past it is also a really nice touch in general. Starting up the campaign though, we of course get the basic setup for the story. In Joint Assault, we play as members of Ontaris Squadron, a group of fighter pilots who were freshly hired by a private military company or PMC called Martinez Security. In the early missions, we work alongside another squadron of Martinez Security known as Rivalry Squadron, defending Tokyo from a terrorist attack. And yes, you heard me right, I said Tokyo. For the first time in the Ace Combat series, this game takes place on the Earth that we know instead of Strange Real. Because of this, you'll fight in places like Tokyo, Egypt, London, San Francisco, and various other real-world locations throughout the campaign. And while I know that a lot of players really love the setting of Strange Real, I would be lying if I said I didn't find it really refreshing to play an Ace Combat game set on Earth. It was really cool to be in the middle of a mission and then just see something like the Tokyo Tower or the Golden Gate Bridge, and it honestly really grounds the game in an interesting way that the series hasn't seen before. But during these initial missions, we're told that the enemy fighters have been identified as members of the terrorist group Wallachia, a group that was formed after the fall of the Soviet Union who intend to form a new nation in the name of communism. This will be important for later in the story, but for now, let's finally get to talking about the core gameplay a little more. The first thing that I would like to point out is that Join Assault actually features a proper tutorial for the first time in franchise history. The beginning of the first mission sees the player going out on an exercise with Rigel Squadron where they teach players the basic controls and fundamentals of the Ace Combat games. Obviously, I'm 10 games into the series at this point, so I didn't need to be taught the basics of the game, but if this was your first Ace Combat game, this would obviously help a lot with the initial process of picking up and learning the game, so I definitely see this as a positive addition. Something else that I noticed right away is that my starter plane felt incredibly slow compared to previous games, and the more that I played Join Assault, the more I realized why that is. ACX2 has the most realistic weight and physics in the franchise up to this point, and while I really enjoyed having these things back in Ace Combat 3, I feel like they went a little too far here. In AC3, it felt like it was just enough to add a little bit of extra satisfaction to the core gameplay, but here in Join Assault, it feels like it completely changes the way that your plane handles. Most planes have had their rolling slowed down a good bit, and they've universally made it so that if you try to dip your nose to pitch downwards, you can do so, but it's significantly slower than just flipping upside down and pulling up. And while these things are more realistic, let's not kid ourselves. Ace Combat has never been about realism, and these changes just make for a game that feels worse to control than its predecessors. Along with this, the third-person view now has this slight offset where you can see the plane move around the screen a little bit, like when it goes to the side before rolling, or gets closer to or farther away from the camera based on your speed. This stuff looks really cool when you're watching gameplay or when you first start playing the game, but for me personally, I ended up hating it after only a few minutes due to one big issue: motion sickness. Now, I'm not typically someone who's prone to motion sickness, and I've never experienced any of it while playing the Ace Combat games despite all the spinning and twirling around in the sky, but it was bad in this game. Unlocking the plane model and letting it swing around on screen like that means that the player's brain loses its consistent anchor point on screen, and so a lot of people, even like myself, are going to experience motion sickness when playing Join Assault. Now, of course, you can always just switch to the HUD or the cockpit views and immediately fix this, as I often did whenever it was starting to get bad for me, but it's just unfortunate that I had to do that in the first place, as the third-person view is normally my favorite perspective to play in. One change to the core systems that I did really enjoy though is that after a mission, some of your payment will be deducted in order to repair your plane and pay for the costs of the ammunition you used during it. This feeds more into the feeling of being a mercenary working for a PMC, and not only does it remind me of paying for repairs way back in air combat, but it also weirdly reminds me a lot of the payment deduction systems that Armored Core is known for. It's not a significant enough deduction to where you can ruin your entire payday by using all your ammo or by getting shot a lot, but just having that little bit that you have to pay at the end not only adds to the immersion, but also incentivizes you to strive for better gameplay by not getting shot and by conserving your ammo as much as possible. A bit of an awkward addition though is that of the mission phases. Almost every mission in Join Assault has multiple phases to them, which are essentially just smaller cut-up segments of the mission that I believe are being used to either load more assets into the level or to move the player to a different map entirely. The reason that I say these are awkward is just because you'll be playing the mission like normal, and after you complete an objective, the game will fade to black before quickly fading back in with you in a different spot and having a new objective. Like I said, I think this is being done because of the technical limitations of the PSP, but it's just sort of jarring whenever it happens, and I thought it was worth a mention here. That being said though, the missions in this game are pretty great, especially when it comes to the variety. The game does a much better job mixing up the air-to-air and the air-to-ground missions than mainline titles like AC5 or 6 did, and on top of that, there are some missions that are really special in this one. My personal favorite in terms of creativity is one where we need to fly a VIP to their destination in a commercial airliner, but we're ambushed by Valahia along the way, and the game has us dip into a trench and fly through it at high speeds to escape from them. And it should go without saying, but due to the size of this thing, navigating through the trench is really intense, and because we have no weapons on it, the designers are able to get away with including such a difficult flight-based challenge, since players are able to entirely focus in on just the flying part for this mission. There are other things in this game that are of note, like the fact that it also has the hardest tunnel run of the series so far, but we'd be here for ages if we went into all of it, so I'll just hope that you all take my word when I say that Access Games still seems to have more creativity when it comes to the mission design than Project Aces themselves. And as these things naturally work out, that great mission variety also leads to Joint Assault having some pretty great pacing. Along with the missions just constantly changing things up as you play, they also hit the mark on things like building tension through set pieces and the storytelling, which is more than some previous Ace Combat games are able to say. They do a great job building up to climactic battles with super weapons, much like in the first ACX, but they also do a great job with building up the tension between you and your rivals. See, a few missions into the game, Rigel Squadron is contacted by the leader of Wallachia mid-mission, and they decide to join up with them since they're offering better pay than Martinez security. Because of this, you'll encounter them throughout the game as enemies now, having been renamed to Varkalak Squadron after joining Wallachia. I talked about it a bit back in my review of Ace Combat 0, but building tension for and giving context to these larger encounters ahead of time really helps to sell the moment once you eventually get there, and not every game in the series has done a very good job with this, so I feel like it's important to praise the game's developers when they manage to get this stuff right. And speaking of things that are pretty inconsistent among the Ace Combat series, there's the difficulty. And much like the first Ace Combat X, this game is definitely on the harder end of the scale among the Ace Combat games, and I can definitely tell you that it's the hardest time any of these games have given me on a first playthrough since Air Combat. A lot of that seems to come from the game's co-op nature, as it's clearly been balanced around the idea of having at least a couple players at any given time, requiring players to do things like fight multiple super weapons at one time while they coordinate attacks and flight formations. It definitely offers one of the stronger challenges out of the Ace Combat series, so if you pride yourself on being pretty good at these games and you haven't checked this one out yet, then you should definitely try to pick it up and give it a quick shot on hard mode, and I guarantee you will not be disappointed. But let's get to the real, most important part of the Ace Combat games: the music. I hadn't really heard anything about this game's soundtrack before playing it for myself, but I have to say, this is definitely one of my favorites from the series so far. It has a lot of great original tracks, and it also has a bunch of music from Air Combat, Ace Combat 2, and even Ace Combat 3 included. So not only do you get a bunch of awesome original music here, but you also get a healthy dose of nostalgia from those earlier titles, and it's some really good stuff. Here, take a quick listen and see what you think. But one thing that I really didn't expect from the Ace Combat series at this point was the extensive plane customization featured in this game. The part tuning feature from ACX has been brought back, except now the customization can be applied to all planes instead of only the fictional ones, and the only limitation is that certain planes can only be equipped with certain parts. Along with that, I should mention that there's a total of 44 different playable aircraft in this game available for players, and the sheer amount of variation in what plane can be flown with what parts starts to get pretty wild. And that's before I even tell you about this next part. Do any of you guys who have been around for the whole series remember when I said I would love for the weapon customization from Ace Combat 3 to come back? Well, it did. The more you use a plane in X2, the more weapons you'll unlock for it after every mission completion, allowing you to change not only your special weapons, but also your standard missiles. You can replace them with lightweight missiles that deal less damage but also cost less to fire during a mission, or high accuracy missiles that have significantly stronger tracking at the cost of needing to be fired within 1100 meters of your target. I definitely didn't get to see every new weapon type that was available, as I only flew about half the planes in the game, and because I was changing them so frequently, I didn't get to unlock many of the extra weapons. But this, along with the amount of planes and parts that I mentioned before, just leads to a ridiculous amount of customization being present here, which I of course love, as some of you will know that I talked about how cool more customization would be all the way back in my air combat video at the start of the series. And as a little cherry on top, you can also unlock various emblems by completing certain challenges throughout the game, which you can then put on your jet as you please, just giving you that little bit of extra cosmetic appeal that some players might be looking for. But coming full circle on the story, I'm not going to go super in-depth with the explanation, but over the course of the game, you'll slowly uncover a conspiracy where the CEO of an insurance company has been paying Valahia to carry out their attacks throughout the game to strike fear into the general population, and start selling an insurance policy that covers damages caused by the war. It's not the best story by any means, but the concept in and of itself was such a breath of fresh air compared to the majority of Ace Combat stories, so even though it was an admittedly lackluster story set in the real world instead of Strange Real, I still found myself pretty entertained by it, at least during my time in the game. And as I mentioned earlier, part of that is that I really enjoyed the rivalry with Varkalak Squadron throughout the game, which just so happens to lead us into what might be the most difficult final boss of the series so far. During the final mission, they show up, taunting us as they normally do, but this time, they're piloting a new series of super fighters that Valahia has developed. Players will have to fight all 4 of them at once, but the leader of the squadron, Suleimani, has a machine gun mounted on the back of his plane that automatically shoots down any missiles tracking him. Because of this, we have to shoot down the other 3 fighters first, which is difficult enough on its own, before focusing in on Suleimani, being forced into fighting him entirely with our machine guns while he's maneuvering with a fighter that's far better than anything available to us. And to make this even more difficult, he goes completely crazy once at low health, never even stopping for as much as a second to give us a window to fire back, and being more aggressive than any pilot AI in the series so far. This fight alone got more deaths out of me than any other mission in the entire series up to this point, and it even killed me more times than some entire games have. But thankfully, this is the best kind of boss fight in a game where even though it was so difficult for me to beat it, it never felt like the game was cheating me out of a win, and it was always my fault, meaning that it was so satisfying when I finally overcame it, and I felt like I had really accomplished something here. Overall, I think there's a lot of good stuff in Ace Combat X2, but I also think that it's massively held back by some of the changes to the core gameplay. Things like the mission variety, customization, and overall challenge are great, but when they're put in a game that just doesn't feel as good to play as the previous games, those positives can only carry the experience so far. There are a lot of amazing ideas here that I genuinely hope come back for a future mainline entry in the series, but I just can't rate this game as highly as a lot of its predecessors because it's just frustrating to play when I know how much of a downgrade the overall game feel is here. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Ace Combat X2 Joint Assault a 7.1. Hey guys, thanks for stopping by. Once again, as a little bonus for those of you that watch all the way through, down in the comments, I'll be pinning a poll for the next review series that we're going to do after Ace Combat and Metal Gear, and there's like 50 or so game franchises on there, so just go ahead and check the box next to all that apply. I'm not looking for your favorite, I'm just looking for all of them that you would enjoy, just so that I can get the best idea of what kind of content you guys will enjoy going forward. So please, if you've made it this far into the video, feel free to go down below and vote on that. It helps out a lot with the channel, and obviously it lets me create content that you guys will enjoy. If you liked this video, check on screen for more entries in the series, and feel free to subscribe if you like my work. And if you find yourself falling in love with this stuff, maybe check out my Patreon and become a part of the amazing group that makes all these videos possible. Thanks guys, and I'll hope to see all of you back here next time on the next Ace Combat review.